our presentation, we will be breaking down the progressive movement into multiple sections. For one, what was the progressive movement? The unhelpfully broad answer is a movement spanning between the late 1800s and early 1900s focused on improving society. What was there to improve on? Well, a lot. Life kinda sucked back then, particularly if you were an immigrant, woman, or a small business. This was due mainly to lack of representation, corruption, unregulated capitalism, and lack of labor laws. But how did these things affect citizens? Well, for one, senators were not elected by the people, but by the state legislators. They also did not make decisions that would benefit the people, but corporations themselves, as they were on the corporation's payroll. Also, workers were treated like garbage. They were expendable and easily manipulated. This caused the ultra-rich to live extravagant lives while the rest struggled to get by on overpopulated slums.
This uneven distribution of wealth was warranted mainly by unregulated capitalism. For instance, John can start a company with one truck. If he does well, he can buy another truck, expanding his market. By expanding his market, he earns more money. He can then buy another truck, expanding his market even further. This cycle repeats until you get something like Walmart. The only problem is that back then, there were no unions. That way, if John wanted to buy another truck by cutting everyone's pay 15%, he could. Not many people could speak out against him, and if they did, they could suck it and find a new job.
So what did they want? Naturally, progressivists desired more representation, laws against monopolies, and rights for all citizens. How did they plan on accomplishing this? Muckraking was a huge part of the progressive movement because it brought attention to issues that were previously unknown. This included corruption in the government and the god-awful working conditions of immigrants and children. Two well-known muckrakers were Ida M. Tarbell and John Spargo. Both focused on big corporations, revealing their flaws. Tarbell focused mainly on Standard Oil's violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, while Spargo focused on the child labor. Both were very impactful. Now about that whole women's rights thing. The women's suffrage movement actually began more around the late 1840s. Women wished for rights to vote along with black men when the notion of African American suffrage became more common. While black suffrage picked up, women's suffrage did not. The movement continued, however, for years afterward into the 20th century. One of the most famous suffragettes was Susan B. Anthony. She fought for women's rights throughout her entire life, averaging around 75 to 100 speeches a year. Susan B. Anthony fought for women's suffrage up to the day she died, which was March 13, 1906. While she died, her message did not. This was mainly because of her part in the creation of the NWSA, which later became NAWSA with the merging of the AWSA. They continued to fight for rights into Woodrow Wilson's presidency until they were finally granted. But what about those workers?
Now, until labor unions were formed, corporations treated their workers the same way Keith Richards treats his liver, poorly. As we said before, their living conditions were less than ideal. Unions allowed them to form together and take a stand for what they felt was their right as American employees. There's actually an interesting anecdote regarding the treatment of workers before labor unions. A man named George Pullman, whose company dealt with manufacturing specialized railroad cars, created a company town for all of his workers to live in called Pullman Town. The workers were paid in a special currency called Pullman dollars, and these dollars were only valid in his town. So essentially, he could cut their already fake wage whenever and however much he wanted. Just to kick them while they were down, he would raise rent and cut wages. Immigrants were easy targets for corporations to manipulate, as they couldn't join unions such as the AFL. The IWW was the first union that allowed immigrants to join, and it gave them much more leverage over the corporations than they had before.
Finally, what about the small businesses? Trusts were giant holding companies displaying monopolistic tendencies. However, some trusts were good and some were bad. Good trusts encouraged companies to have good prices and were competitive, while bad trusts destroyed the competition and raised prices. Roosevelt was known as a trust buster, but was very careful to make the distinction between the two. When companies got to a certain point, nothing could stop them. Standard Oil is a fantastic example of this in that they bought up other oil barreling companies and refineries. This way, they owned everything involved in the business, making it impossible for other companies to compete in the market. This was all in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, yet they managed to stay on top through relocation to New Jersey, which allowed companies to hold shares in other companies. Finally, in 1911, the Sherman Act caught up to them, and Standard Oil was broken into 33 separate companies. After this, the Clayton and Federal Trade Commission Acts of 1914 were passed, making it illegal to perform monopolistic mergers or any other form of anti-competitive behavior. So what do we have to thank the Progressive Era for? Well, we have women's suffrage, rights for immigrants, labor laws, labor unions, better education, representation, laws against monopolies, more information, and just basic civil liberties. Thanks, Progressive Movement, and thank you.